I never expected that a plumbing disaster would change my life, but that's exactly what happened when my neighbor knocked on my door at midnight. It's funny how the biggest shifts often start with the smallest, most inconvenient moments. A burst pipe, a frantic knock, and a question that ended up meaning so much more than either of us realized at the time. My life, before Caleb, was a study in quiet routine. My name is Miles, and at 27, I had curated an existence that was perfectly ordered, predictable, and, if I was being honest with myself, profoundly lonely. I worked from home as a data analyst, which meant my days were a silent conversation between me and spreadsheets, the rhythmic click of my keyboard the only consistent soundtrack. My apartment was my sanctuary, a small one-bedroom on the third floor of an old brick building that smelled perpetually of dust and rain-soaked concrete. It was neat, minimalist, and a perfect reflection of my internal landscape, everything in its place, with no room for surprises. I liked my solitude, or at least, I told myself I did. It was safe. There were no messy emotions to navigate, no expectations to fail, no vulnerabilities to expose. My interactions were limited to polite nods with neighbors in the hallway, the cashier at the corner store, and the delivery guy who brought my groceries once a week. It was a life lived behind a screen, both literally and figuratively. I watched the world, but I wasn't really a part of it. Then Caleb moved into apartment 3B, directly across the hall. The first time I saw him, he was wrestling a massive, antique-looking workbench through his doorway, his bicep flexing with the effort. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a cascade of unruly dark hair that fell into his eyes. He wore a paint-splattered t-shirt and worn jeans, and he moved with a kind of grounded confidence that I could only ever dream of possessing. He was, in a word, distracting. From that day on, my quiet routine was punctuated by the sounds of his life. The low thrum of a power sander in the afternoon, the gentle tap-tap-tapping of a chisel in the evening, the faint sound of a classic rock station playing through the walls. He was a woodworker, I gathered, a creator of things in a way that felt wonderfully tangible and real compared to my world of abstract numbers. I'd see him coming and going, sometimes carrying planks of wood, other times covered in a fine layer of sawdust that clung to his eyelashes. He always smiled at me. It wasn't a perfunctory, neighborly smile. It was genuine, reaching his eyes, which were a warm, deep shade of brown. "Hey, Miles," he'd say, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. He'd learned my name from a package left outside my door one day. I, on the other hand, had learned his from the label on his mailbox, and I felt a small, ridiculous thrill every time he used my name, as if it solidified my existence in his world. In my head, he was the picture of a guy who had it all figured out. He was handsome, skilled, and exuded an effortless charm. I imagined him with a beautiful girlfriend, a life full of friends and loud, happy gatherings that probably involved craft beer and bonfires. He was the sun, and I was a planet in a distant, uninteresting orbit. He was completely and utterly unattainable, a fact I accepted with a familiar, dull ache of resignation. He was just another person who would exist in the periphery of my carefully constructed, lonely life. So I observed him from a distance, cataloging his smiles and the sound of his work, never imagining our worlds would do more than briefly touch in the shared space of our hallway. But that's the thing about life, isn't it? Just when you think you've got the orbit all mapped out, something comes along and knocks you completely off course. For me, that something was the sound of rushing water, and it arrived on a Tuesday, just after midnight. I had been up late, wrestling with a dataset that refused to make sense. The rest of the building was quiet, settled into the deep sleep of a weeknight. The only sound was the hum of my laptop and the distant siren wailing its way across the city. I had just decided to give up for the night, my eyes gritty with fatigue, when I heard it. A frantic, heavy knocking on my door. It wasn't a polite tap. It was urgent, insistent, and it made my heart jump into my throat. I froze for a second. Midnight visitors were not part of my routine. My mind raced through a list of unlikely but terrifying possibilities. Finally, I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. My breath caught. It was Caleb. His hair was soaking wet, plastered to his forehead, and his face was a mask of sheer panic. He was breathing heavily, his shoulders heaving. I fumbled with the locks, my hands suddenly clumsy. I swung the door open. "Caleb?" What's wrong? Are you okay? He looked at me, his wide eyes searching my face. Water was dripping from the ends of his hair onto the welcome mat. Miles. Oh, thank God. Are you awake? He asked, his voice strained. He gestured vaguely back toward his own apartment, from under whose door I could now see a dark slick of water seeping out onto the hallway carpet. I have a problem. A really big problem. He ran a hand through his wet hair, looking completely overwhelmed. I'm so sorry to bother you this late. But are you ready for a little chaos? I didn't even have to think about it. Seeing him stripped of his usual easy confidence, looking so lost and vulnerable, flipped a switch in me. The carefully constructed walls of my solitude crumbled in an instant. Yes, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Of course. Come in. He stepped inside, and with him came the smell of damp plaster and the palpable energy of a crisis in full swing. He was dripping onto my pristine hardwood floors, but for the first time in my life, I didn't care about the mess. A pipe had burst in the wall behind his shower, he explained in a rush of words. It wasn't just a leak, it was a deluge. He'd woken up to the sound of a waterfall in his bathroom and found his apartment quickly turning into a shallow lake. He had already called the building's emergency maintenance line, but the damage was done. Everything is soaked, he said, his voice laced with disbelief. My tools, the wood I was working on for a commission, my bed. It's all just wet. He finally looked at me, a flicker of embarrassment in his eyes. Look, I know this is a massive imposition, but the super said it's going to take days to fix. They have to tear out the wall. I don't suppose I could crash on your couch for a night or two. I can pay you, of course. I just don't have anywhere else to go right now. The idea of Caleb, this vibrant, overwhelming person, being inside my quiet space for days was both terrifying and exhilarating. My apartment felt too small, too plain, too much a reflection of me. It was like inviting the sun into a cave. But looking at his stressed face, seeing the genuine desperation there was no other possible answer. This was a person who needed help, and I was a person who could provide it. It was that simple. Don't be ridiculous, I said, trying to sound casual, as if I had people crashing at my place all the time. You don't have to pay me. Of course you can stay. Let me get you some towels. And just like that, the quiet, predictable rhythm of my life was broken. Caleb was in my living room, a displaced, damp, and utterly captivating force of nature. He brought with him a duffel bag containing a few salvaged clothes and a dop kit. He looked around my space, his eyes taking in the sparse furniture, the neatly stacked books, the single piece of abstract art on the wall. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of self-consciousness, worried he was judging the starkness of it all. You keep it really clean, he commented, but there was no judgment in his voice, only observation. He toweled his hair dry with the towel I'd given him, and the simple, domestic act felt strangely intimate in the silence of my apartment. I made up the couch for him with my only spare set of sheets and a pillow from my own bed, feeling a weird jolt as I imagined him sleeping there, just a few feet away from my room. That first night, neither of us slept much. The sounds of industrial fans and dehumidifiers humming from across the hall were a constant reminder of the chaos. For my part, I just lay in bed, hyper-aware of his presence. I could hear the soft sound of his breathing from the living room, the occasional rustle as he shifted on the couch. My world had shrunk to the size of my apartment, and he was at the very center of it. It was unsettling and, to my surprise, not entirely unpleasant. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar feeling, began to flicker in the quiet darkness. The next few days unfolded in a way I never could have anticipated. Having Caleb as a temporary roommate fundamentally altered the atmosphere of my apartment. The space, which had always felt like a quiet echo chamber for my own thoughts, was now filled with his presence. It was in the scent of his soap lingering in the bathroom in the morning, the sight of his worn leather boots by the door, the low murmur of his voice on the phone as he dealt with contractors and insurance agents. We fell into an easy, unspoken rhythm. I'd wake up early, as was my habit, and find him already awake, sketching in a notebook at my small dining table, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. He was surprisingly quiet and considerate for someone I had imagined as being constantly in motion. He was neat, folding the blanket on the couch every morning, and insisted on cooking dinner to pay his rent, as he put it. And let me explain something. The man could cook. The first night, he transformed the simple contents of my fridge into an incredible pasta dish with a sauce that tasted like it had been simmering for hours. We ate at my little table, the one I usually used as an extension of my desk. It was the first time I'd shared a meal with someone in my apartment in over a year. "So, data analyst, huh?" he said, swirling pasta onto his fork. "What does that actually involve? I just picture you like something out of The Matrix, with green numbers falling down a screen." I laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt rusty from disuse. "It's not that exciting, trust me. It's mostly just looking for patterns. Trying to make sense of a whole lot of noise." I found myself explaining my job to him, something I usually avoided because it tended to make people's eyes glaze over. But Caleb listened. He actually listened, asking questions that showed he was interested, not just being polite. "It sounds like sculpting, in a way," he concluded thoughtfully. "You're taking this raw, messy block of information and carving it until a shape emerges. Something that has meaning." I was floored. No one had ever described my work like that. No one had ever seen the art in it. I guess so," I stammered. "I never thought of it that way." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the handsome exterior to the thoughtful person underneath. "What about you? The workbench, the sanding, you're a woodworker?" His face lit up. This was clearly his passion. He told me about his small business, crafting custom furniture. But then he hesitated, a flicker of something I couldn't quite read in his eyes. "The furniture pays the bills," he said, pushing a stray piece of pasta around his plate. "But that's not what I really love to do." He got up and retrieved the sketchbook he'd been drawing in earlier. He opened it and turned it toward me. My breath hitched. The pages weren't filled with designs for tables and chairs. They were filled with stunningly intricate sketches of animals, of human figures in motion, of abstract, flowing shapes that seemed to twist and dance on the page. They were designs for sculptures. "This is my real work," he said quietly. "Or what I want to be my real work. I make sculptures from reclaimed wood. I have a show coming up at a small gallery in a few months, and the piece that got damaged in the flood, it was the centerpiece." He looked defeated for a moment, the stress of the situation finally showing through his calm exterior. Seeing that flash of vulnerability was like finding a key to a locked room. This confident, capable man had insecurities and dreams, just like me. He wasn't some untouchable figure from a different world. He was just a person trying to make sense of the noise, just like I was. My perception of him shifted, deepened. The attraction I felt, which had been a shallow thing based on his smile and the set of his shoulders, was transforming into something more profound, something that resonated with a part of me I had long kept dormant. Later that evening, we were cleaning up the kitchen together. It was a comfortable silence, the clinking of plates and the rush of water from the tap filling the space between us. I was washing, and he was drying. As I handed him a wet plate, our fingers brushed. It was a tiny, insignificant moment, the kind of accidental touch that happens a million times a day between people. But it wasn't insignificant. A jolt, like a static shock, shot up my arm. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. I glanced up at him, and he was already looking at me, his hand frozen in midair, the dish towel hanging from his fingers. His brown eyes were dark and unreadable, and for a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to shrink to the few inches of air separating our hands. He cleared his throat and took the plate, his gaze dropping. The moment was gone as quickly as it had arrived, but it left an imprint, a lingering warmth on my skin and a frantic, hopeful pounding in my chest. Something had happened in that tiny, accidental touch. A question had been asked, silently, and neither of us knew the answer. But for the first time, I felt like we were both searching for it. The next evening, the third of Caleb's stay, found me in a state of quiet agony. I was trying to finish a project, but a brutal tension headache was wrapping its fingers around the base of my skull and squeezing. It was the kind of headache that made light feel like a physical assault and every small sound like a hammer blow. I had turned off the overhead lights, leaving only the soft glow of my desk lamp, and was pressing my thumbs into my temples, trying in vain to work out the knots of pain. I was so focused on the throbbing in my head that I didn't hear Caleb come in. He'd been across the hall, checking on the progress of the repairs. The first I knew of his presence was his voice, soft and low, right beside me. "Hey, you okay? You look like you're in pain." I flinched, startled, and dropped my hands from my face. "Oh, hey, Yeah, I'm fine. Just a headache. I get them when I stare at the screen for too long. I tried to offer him a reassuring smile, but it felt more like a grimace. The effort alone sent a fresh spike of pain through my skull. He didn't move away. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe of my home office, his arms crossed over his chest, studying me with an expression of genuine concern. The silence stretched for a moment, filled only by the low hum of my computer. The air between us felt thick, charged with the unspoken memory of our touch in the kitchen the night before. I was intensely aware of him, of his stillness, of the way the dim light carved shadows on his face. I used to get headaches like that, he said, his voice still quiet. My mom taught me something that helps. It might sound weird, but do you trust me? The question hung in the air. Did I trust him? A few days ago, he was just the handsome stranger across the hall. But now, after sharing meals, secrets, and the close confines of my apartment, after seeing his vulnerability and feeling that strange spark between us, yes, I heard myself say, the word coming out softer than I intended. He nodded slowly, a small, almost shy smile touching his lips. Okay, come on, lie down on the couch. He gestured toward the living room. My heart started to beat a frantic, uneven rhythm. This felt significant. This felt like a boundary was about to be crossed, and I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I knew I didn't want to stop it. I followed him into the living room and lay down on the couch, my head on the armrest. The cushions still held a faint, lingering scent of him. I felt incredibly exposed, lying there while he stood over me. He disappeared for a moment and came back with a glass of water. Drink this, he commanded gently. I obeyed without question. Then, he sat down on the floor beside the couch, so close that his knee was almost touching my shoulder. My entire body tensed. Just try to relax, he murmured. Close your eyes. I did as he said, my eyelids fluttering shut. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I held my breath, waiting. And then I felt his hands. They were warm and slightly rough from his work, calloused in a way that spoke of creating things. He started at my shoulders, his thumbs pressing firmly but gently into the tight muscles there, working his way up my neck. It was incredible. He moved with a practiced, confident touch, finding every single point of tension and slowly, patiently, easing it. My breath hitched when his fingers threaded into my hair at the base of my skull. He cradled my head in his large hands, his thumbs beginning to make slow, deliberate circles at my temples. The pain in my head didn't vanish instantly, but it began to recede, to soften at the edges, replaced by this overwhelming wave of sensation. It was more than just a physical release. It was an act of profound care. No one had touched me with such tenderness in years, if ever. The room was completely silent. I focused on the feeling of his hands, the pressure of his thumbs on my skin, the sound of our breathing mingling in the quiet space. My analytical mind, the one that was always running, always processing, finally went still. There was no room for thought, only feeling. A deep, bone-weary gratitude washed over me, so potent it felt like it might break me. He said nothing. He just continued his slow, rhythmic massage, his focus entirely on me. It felt like it lasted for an eternity and for no time at all. It was the most intimate thing I had ever experienced, more intimate than any fumbling, disconnected encounter from my past. It was an act of giving, of pure, unselfish attention. In that moment, under the gentle pressure of his hands, I felt seen. I felt cared for. And as the last vestiges of my headache melted away, they were replaced by a dangerous, terrifying, and absolutely wonderful hope. The turning point had arrived, not with a crash, but with a quiet, healing touch. The next morning, the apartment was filled with a silence that was entirely different from the peaceful quiet I was used to. It was a heavy, charged silence, thick with unspoken words and unanswered questions. The easy camaraderie we had built over the last few days had vanished, replaced by a palpable awkwardness that seemed to cling to the air like humidity. We were two strangers again, but strangers who now shared a secret, a moment of intimacy that neither of us knew how to address. When I got up, Caleb was already in the kitchen, making coffee. He didn't look at me, keeping his back turned as he measured out the grounds. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice carefully neutral. "Morning," I replied, my own voice sounding thin and unfamiliar. I hovered in the doorway, unsure of the new choreography. Before, I would have walked right in, grabbed a mug, and leaned against the counter next to him. Now, the small kitchen felt like a minefield. Every potential movement seemed fraught with meaning. He poured 2 mugs of coffee and pushed one across the counter toward me without meeting my eyes. "Thanks," I said, my fingers brushing his as I took it. We both flinched, pulling our hands back instantly. The memory of his touch from the night before, so deliberate and gentle, was a stark contrast to this clumsy, accidental contact. It was like an echo of a song that had been beautiful but was now just a painful reminder. I retreated to my office with my coffee, closing the door partway. I couldn't focus on work. My mind was a relentless loop, replaying every second of the massage. The warmth of his hands, the concern in his voice, the feeling of utter safety as he cared for me. I analyzed it from every possible angle, the way I would analyze a data set, searching for a pattern, for meaning. Was it just an act of kindness? A simple, friendly gesture from a decent person who knew how to help with a headache? That was the logical, rational explanation. It was the safe explanation. It was the one that would allow things to go back to normal, to retreat back into my shell and file this whole experience away as a strange but pleasant anomaly. My fear desperately clung to this version of events. It was the version that protected me from heartbreak. But my heart, that foolish, hopeful part of me that had been dormant for so long, argued for a different interpretation. It latched onto the way he had looked at me before asking if I trusted him. It seized upon the charged silence in the room, the focused intensity of his touch. That hadn't felt merely friendly. It had felt personal. It had felt intimate. Hope whispered that maybe, just maybe, it meant what I wanted it to mean. That the spark I felt wasn't just in my own head. This internal battle raged all day. Hope versus fear. Vulnerability versus self-preservation. Every time I stepped out of my office, the tension was there. We moved around each other with a new, careful precision, like dancers who had forgotten the steps to a familiar routine. We made small talk about the weather, about the progress on his apartment, about anything and everything except what was really on our minds. The space between us was now a chasm, and I had no idea how to cross it. He spent most of the afternoon across the hall, talking to the superintendent. I was relieved by his absence, grateful for a reprieve from the suffocating awkwardness. But the moment he was gone, the apartment felt cavernously empty. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was lonely. I had gotten used to the sounds of his life intertwined with mine, and their sudden absence was a stark, painful reminder of what I stood to lose. When he came back, his expression was grim. "So, good news and bad news," he said, avoiding my gaze as he dropped his keys on the small table by the door. "The good news is, they finished the repairs. The new drywall is up, and everything's dry. The bad news is, I can move back in tomorrow." My stomach plummeted. Tomorrow. He was leaving tomorrow. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. This strange, temporary world we had built within the walls of my apartment was about to end. He would go back across the hall, and I would be left here, alone with the memory of his presence and the ghost of his touch. The silence would return, but it would never feel the same. It would be a silence defined by his absence. And in that moment, I knew the safe explanation wasn't enough. I couldn't bear the thought of him leaving without knowing. The next day passed in a blur of quiet tension. Caleb spent the morning slowly moving his things back into his apartment. It wasn't much, just the duffel bag, his sketchbook, and a few other personal items he'd brought over. Each trip he made across the hall felt like a step further away from me, widening the chasm between us until it felt impossibly vast. I stayed in my office, pretending to work, but mostly I just stared at a spreadsheet, the numbers swimming meaninglessly before my eyes. By late afternoon, he was done. He knocked softly on my office doorframe. I looked up, and he was standing there, looking just as uncomfortable and lost as I felt. The easy confidence he usually wore was gone, replaced by a raw uncertainty that mirrored my own. "Well, that's everything," he said, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I'm all moved back in." "Oh, great," I said, my voice sounding hollow. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it, the moment of departure. He would say thank you. I would say you're welcome, and the door would close between us, perhaps forever. The thought was unbearable. He lingered in the doorway, not leaving. "Listen, Miles," he started, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I was beginning to recognize as a sign of his anxiety. I can't thank you enough for this. For letting me stay, for everything. You really saved me. It was nothing, I said, the words automatic, meaningless. I was happy to help. An agonizing silence fell between us. He opened his mouth to say something else, then closed it, shaking his head slightly as if in defeat. He looked down at the floor, then finally met my eyes. His gaze was intense, searching, and filled with a desperate conflict that I felt deep in my own soul. And then, he took a breath, as if steeling himself. That's not what I really want to say, he said, his voice low and firm, cutting through the tension. He took a step into the room, closing the distance between us. My world narrowed to his face, his dark eyes, the nervous set of his jaw. I have to be honest with you. My breath caught in my throat. I could only nod, unable to speak. The flood was real, he began, his voice shaking just a little. The pipe really did burst. But I lied about something. I told you I had nowhere else to go. That wasn't true. I have a buddy who lives 10 minutes from here. I could have stayed with him. Confusion warred with a wild, burgeoning hope in my chest. Then why? He took another step closer. We were only a few feet apart now. Because I wanted to stay here, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. With you. Miles, I've been noticing you for months. Ever since I moved in. I'd see you in the hall, always looking so focused, and I wanted to talk to you, but I never knew how. I kept trying to work up the nerve, but I just couldn't. I was afraid I was reading things wrong. Afraid of making a fool of myself. He let out a short, self-deprecating laugh. Then the pipe burst, and it felt like some kind of sign. It was this crazy, stupid opportunity. An excuse to talk to you, to be near you. So I took it. I knocked on your door, and I lied. And these last few days, they've been better than I even imagined. He finally looked directly at me, his eyes shining with a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. And last night, he said, his voice thick with emotion, when I touched you, that wasn't just about your headache. I wanted to take care of you. I feel something for you, Miles. Something real. The air left my lungs in a rush. The words I had been too afraid to even hope for were real, hanging in the space between us. All my fear, all my anxiety, all my careful self-protection, it all just melted away, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. It wasn't just me. He felt it too. I found my voice, and it was steadier than I ever thought it could be. I feel it too, Caleb. The admission was freeing, like a weight I didn't even know I was carrying had been lifted from my chest. I feel it too. A slow, breathtaking smile spread across his face. It was like watching the sun rise. And in 2 short strides, he closed the final gap between us. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers gently cupping my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. It was a touch that was questioning and confident all at once. Yeah, he whispered, his eyes searching mine for confirmation. I leaned into his touch, closing my eyes for a brief moment. Yeah, I breathed. And then he kissed me. It wasn't like the hesitant, accidental touches that had come before. This was deliberate, sure, and full of all the unspoken things we had been feeling for days. It was a kiss of relief, of discovery, of a beginning. It was soft and deep and tasted faintly of coffee and courage. And as I kissed him back, wrapping my arms around his neck, I knew that my quiet, orderly world had been irrevocably and wonderfully shattered. In its place, something new and infinitely more beautiful was beginning to grow. The weeks that followed felt like learning a new language, one where every glance, every touch, every shared smile held a universe of meaning. The awkwardness that had plagued us vanished, replaced by a comfortable intimacy that settled over us as easily as a well-worn sweater. My apartment, once a fortress of solitude, became our shared space. His boots found a permanent home by the door next to mine. His sketchbook lived on my coffee table, and the scent of sawdust and his soap became a part of the air I breathed. He never fully moved in, not right away. He kept his place across the hall, his workshop, but more often than not, he'd end his day by walking across the hallway instead of into his own apartment. We cooked dinner together most nights, our hands brushing as we reached for spices, our bodies moving in a comfortable dance in my small kitchen. We learned each other's rhythms, the way I needed quiet in the morning and the way he hummed when he was deep in thought. We went on dates. We walked through the city park on a crisp autumn afternoon, his hand warm and solid in mine. He took me to the little gallery where his work was going to be shown, and he walked me through the space, explaining his vision, his eyes bright with passion. I took him to my favorite quiet bookstore, and we spent hours sitting in worn armchairs, reading side by side in a silence that was companionable and full. I was no longer just an observer of the world. I was a participant, with him by my side. He finally finished the centerpiece for his show. He had to start over, but he said the new one was better. He claimed the chaos of the flood had forced him to rethink it, to find a new shape in the wood. One evening, he took me across the hall to see it. It was a sculpture of two abstract figures, their forms carved from a single, massive piece of reclaimed oak. They flowed into and around each other, separate but inextricably linked, their grain and lines merging. It was powerful and beautiful, and it made my breath catch in my chest. "It's about connection," he said quietly, standing behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist. "About how sometimes two separate things can be brought together by a storm, and they end up creating something stronger and more beautiful than they ever were apart." He rested his chin on my shoulder, and we stood there for a long time, just looking at it. In the smooth, flowing lines of the wood, I saw our story. A few months later, we were lying on my couch, the same couch where he had first slept, the same couch where he had healed my headache with a simple touch. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon, and a soft rain was tapping against the window panes. His head was in my lap, and I was running my fingers through his unruly hair. A book lay forgotten on my chest. It was a quiet, perfect moment, one of many that now made up the fabric of my life. He tilted his head back to look up at me, a soft, contented smile on his face. "You know," he said, his voice a low rumble, "for a disaster, that burst pipe was the best thing that ever happened to me." I smiled back, leaning down to press a soft kiss to his forehead. "You have no idea," I murmured against his skin. I thought about the man I was before he knocked on my door, cautious, isolated, and living a life in grayscale. Caleb had brought the color, the noise, the beautiful, unpredictable chaos. He hadn't just crashed on my couch. He had crashed into my life, breaking down walls I didn't even know I had built. Life is funny that way, isn't it? You spend so much time building routines and fortifications, trying to protect yourself from the unexpected. You think you want order and predictability. But sometimes, the greatest gifts don't arrive neatly wrapped. They arrive like a flood in the middle of the night, disrupting everything you thought you knew and leaving behind a foundation for something you never knew you needed.